Ha ha ha, if you thought I was done, no, I wasn't. Second part. The story isn't a story of death. The story is a story of grace. And so I want to wrap up thinking about self-regard, our regard for ourselves. Now, self-regard is not the same as self-esteem. There was a psychological movement in the 60s and 70s talking about how we need to build up our self-esteem. Interestingly, a lot of the psychologists who did those studies later refused to employ people in their organizations with extremely high self-esteems because they esteemed themselves with very little substance. We're not talking about the thing that pop psychologists talk about. We're not talking about the things which are discussed on daytime talk TV shows. If you have high esteem, you will achieve great things, is utter rubbish. That's not what we're talking about today. But we're also not talking about having a low sense of worth. Many people have high esteem for themselves, but when that's dented or stroked too much, it can be dangerous. They'll become overly developed and they'll do terrible things. Lots of people have no sense of worth for themselves at all. And so they do nothing. It's not to say they don't do anything, but they don't have the inner care for themselves, the inner regard for themselves, a sense of worth that drives them to want to be something in the world. It is a place of absolute desolation. It's a place which is normally preceded by anger and burnout and depression. Often their worth has not been something they've lost. It has been something which has been taken away from them. And so I'm not talking about self-worth and I'm not talking about self-esteem. If you want to sort of draw a picture in your mind for yourself of what I mean by self-regard, think of how we sign letters. We sign letters kind regards, and that means a few things. It means that we respect the recipient at the very least. We probably care for the recipient's well-being, and maybe even that we want to express that we love the recipient in some way. So, how do you regard yourself? It's a difficult question, and I wonder if very often we don't regard ourselves very well. Because if regarding ourselves means respecting ourselves, I don't know that we respect ourselves. Do you sleep enough? Do you eat well? Do we care for ourselves? Are we doing the things we need so that our lives are all that they could possibly be? Do we love ourselves? That's a sermon for another day. But most of the people in my churches throughout my ministry have heard the word said, Jesus tells us, love your neighbor as you do yourself. The problem is that we do, because we don't actually love ourselves. And so, how much do we really regard ourselves? Because when you regard something, you treat it well, you love it, you nurture it, you push it to do better, and you value it as a gift to the world. Do we treat ourselves well? Do we love ourselves? Do we nurture ourselves? Do we push ourselves to be better? And do we value ourselves as a gift to the world? So Ruth is a very significant book. There's one other novella in scriptures about a woman, Esther. Both of these novellas are about endangered women, and both of them hardly mention God. And yet both books are stories where the main characters where God has a very high regard for the main characters. God cares for and loves Ruth. He cares for and loves Esther. Cares for and loves Esther and the characters around them. And because of God's high regard for them, God's redeeming love works in their lives. God is nudging them towards being part of what God is doing in the world. And so let's look at the characters again from the Ruth story very quickly with these glasses. Boaz. We saw before that he's a rich old farmer who probably has no family, almost certainly has no family. All he has to live for is winnowing his barley in awe each year, thinking about the blessing that God has given him, and then drinking away his loneliness and falling asleep on the hay pile next to the barley. But then one day, a pretty young woman sneaks in. He was kind to her in the fields. He noticed her. And in the hay that night, they fall in love. Thank you, he whispers in her ears, for not running after the pretty boys. He falls for her so hard that in our chapter for today, Boaz lies. Boaz is very sly and cunning, and he says to the other guardian redeemer, you cannot redeem the property without marrying the widow. Not true. It's not a levirate marriage we're talking about here. The difference is that Boaz wants to marry Ruth. And so he pressures the other guardian redeemer, saying you would have to marry Ruth, so that he tucks tail and runs away, because Boaz wants to marry her. And so for Boaz, God's redeeming love to him is Ruth's love, which redeems his heart. God's redeeming love to Boaz is Ruth's love, which redeems his heart. So to Ruth. We saw before that she'd lost everything. What she'd lost particularly was her security. She didn't own anything. She could only get the food from the field and the grace of other people. She knew what it was to not have a secure home and a regular meal. I wonder how many nights she lay cold and hungry, thinking about life with Marlon in Moab, where she was never hungry, where she had hope and a good, simple life. And so one day, she dolls herself up and she sneaks onto the threshing floor, and she lies down in the hay next to the kindly old farmer who noticed her in the field, who made her feel seen and who gave her plenty to eat. And so God's redeeming love for Ruth is a kind man, a square meal, and the promise of a safe life. God's redeeming love for Ruth is a kind man, a square meal, and the promise of a safe life. So finally, Naomi. Naomi's bitterness has consumed her. She has lost her husband, her sons, her home, her dignity. She feels like she is cursed by God, and everyone in her village will have treated her like she is cursed by God, because only a cursed woman could go through so much suffering. Nothing will ever bring back what she has lost. The one very small blessing she has left is a young, strong, able, deeply devoted and loving daughter-in-law who's providing her meals for her. But Naomi can't give her a son. Naomi can't give her a family to continue the family line. And so God's redeeming love to Naomi is Ruth, who never leaves her side, but also is the bouncing baby boy that her loyal daughter-in-law and her kindly cousin give her to love. God's redeeming love to God's redeeming love to Naomi is Ruth, and the beautiful bouncing baby boy that her loyal daughter-in-law and kindly cousin give her to love. And so the story is a story of redemption, discovering that God still regards them, each one of them, and that they regard each other, and that God is making them whole again together. That's redemption, and that is what grace is. It's this idea that even when life completely sucks, God signs his letters to us, kind regards. We just need to learn to read the letters together. And so the story ends in grace. And so I sign my letters grace instead of kind regards for a number of reasons. I sign my letters grace because of a colleague who knew the grace of Jesus, but never the grace of himself. Because of a foreign girl who knew the gracious regard of an old farmer and was seen. Because of a farmer who knew the gracious regard of a pretty woman who embraced him. Because of the grace of an old woman who regained the regard of her village and herself with God's gift of a son. And because of the great times 28 grandson of that son, who came into the world, grace incarnate, come to be a living reminder of God's regard for us, even when the community regards us as less, and even when we regard ourselves as less, and our regard for ourselves fails. Amen.